So I'll just kind of start talking. My name's Jenny, and I'm the owner of Resolve Physical Therapy. And we are an outpatient clinic that's kind of newer. It'll be 3 years in November that we've been open. Uh, I always tease that we're probably going to owe them a royalty at some point, but we're in the same building as Broken Top Bottle Shop, if you guys are pretty familiar with Bend at this point. And we give webinars probably every other month, is what we try to shoot for on different topics. So we've done some on posture and neck pain. We've done some on running, lower back pain, knee pain, these kinds of things. But recently we've just had a few more patients coming in. I think everybody's trying to get back to working out and into the gym when they were closed for the long time in pandemic. So we've had a few people coming in talking about shoulder pain when they're trying to get back into their weight training. So we thought this would be a good topic. And Casey is one of our staff physical therapists. He'll introduce himself in in a moment here. So he's going to be putting on the presentation tonight. Just so you know, we cannot see anybody. You can only see us and the presentation here. So I can't see you. You can use the chat feature of this if you have any questions throughout the presentation. I'll be off to the side while he does his presentation. So I'll either try to answer them myself or I'll pass on the question to Casey so he can answer them as well. At the end of the presentation, he'll also do kind of a question and answer section. So you'll have a little bit more time to chat back and forth then too. And then, yeah, I think that's it. So I am going to go ahead and hand things over to Casey here.
All right. Good evening, everybody. My name's Casey, like Jenny said, physical therapist here at Resolve Physical Therapy. So we're going to be talking about specifically shoulder pain with weight training. So feel free to pipe up if you have any questions. Like Jenny said, she'll be over working on the chat box there. So there we go. A little bit about me. I was born here in Oregon. I was born in Portland and actually raised in Redmond. Went to Redmond High School. After Redmond High School, I went to Oregon State, got my bachelor's in exercise and sports science. And then after that, I moved to Texas, where I got my doctorate in physical therapy at the University of St. Augustine for health science. It's quite a mouthful. I lived in Texas for a few years, enjoyed it, lived in the city, and frankly, had my fill of the city, and I'm happy to be back in smaller towns. So excited to be here and part of Resolve Physical Therapy. I've known Jenny for quite a few years at this point, and so it's nice to finally be working with her again. Now, as far as the presentation goes, we will be covering different aspects of the shoulder. So we're going to start with simple anatomy, so that way you guys can get a general idea of what it looks like and might help kind of steer you towards some either questions or even some answers as far as what might be happening to you. After anatomy, we'll go through kind of what pain generating structures we have. So the difference between bone or muscle, nerves, connective tissues, things like that, kind of how they differ and what they feel like in pain and how they can be broken down, things like that. After that portion, we will be talking about the identification of the breakdown. So basically trying to figure out what went wrong, how we are able to kind of pinpoint where your pain's coming from without simply just poking it. We do that as physical therapists through different types of special tests that help us kind of direct towards which tissue is involved. We listen to your statement. So we start everything off with an eval and just tell me what happened. We ask you about the types of pain. We ask you about, does it move? Does it travel? What makes it worse? What makes it better? And that really helps us kind of fine tune where we believe that's coming from. And then little things like, oh, does it make noise? Does it pop? Specifically, where does it hurt? Can you pinpoint it, or is it kind of a general area that hurts? All of these pieces we use in order to try to decide what tissue is involved, as well as we look at kind of how you're moving. So typical evaluation, you come in and we do all sorts of testing, not just the special ones for specific tissues, but we look for strength, we look for weaknesses, we look for restricted ranges of motion. Do you have more range of motion than you should? things like we look for differences in between capsular tightness versus muscle tightness, all sorts of things to try to really pinpoint where the pain is coming from. Following that section, we will be talking about motor control. So with motor control, what I mean is, for example, as you're doing certain shoulder movements, we are looking for the scapula, which is known as the shoulder blade, to be doing the movement specifically. Or when we ask for you to do a certain motion, are we seeing that your upper back, otherwise known as your thoracic spine, is causing some motions? Or are you doing abnormal motions with the scapula in order to get those specific pieces to where they need to go, but it's not quite what we're looking for? We call it compensation. And then lastly, we'll round out everything with some talks about strengths versus weaknesses in the muscles. We'll go over some examples. And if something fits into where you guys are at, feel free to pipe in, or if you have questions, again, feel free to ask. So to start things off, we're going to start with the anatomy of the shoulder itself. Excuse me. So the picture I have up here is the shoulder blade on the right-hand side of your body. And the picture on the left is showing you from looking at your back. The picture on the right is as if you were looking through somebody's chest. So that way you kind of know what you're looking at. Now, on the left side of the picture, you can see a part of the rotator cuff, the main majority of it. You have your supraspinatus on top, infraspinatus on bottom, and then real skinny off to the right of that picture on the left is your teres minor. Those three are part of the rotator cuff. And then on the other picture, the right-hand side, you see the big, broad subscapularis. So those are just some of the muscles of the shoulder, but that gives you the idea of what the rotator cuff is, as well as looking at the big points of the shoulder blade. So we're going to refer to the left picture again. The somewhat diagonal kind of bony part you see running through the top portion there, it's called the spine of the scapula. It's used for different muscle attachments. The medial border is that very far left edge of the scapula as well. Again, just places for muscles to attach to. You can kind of see the rotator cuff as well. And then muscles like the trapezius, levator, scapulae, and rhomboids, they all attach to different portions like that as well. And they play with layers as far as what is deep and what's shallow. But that gives you a general idea of the shoulder blade. Next, nerves of the shoulder blade. So the picture I gave you is an example of what we call the brachial plexus. That's looking at somebody's left arm as though you're looking at their chest forward to the back. And basically the brachial plexus is a group of nerves that exit out of kind of the lower neck section or upper back area if you're looking at it. And then they kind of intertwine with each other. They mix, they separate into different branches, all sorts of different things. But basically certain branches of those, as you can kind of tell from the picture, they innervate the upper arm or closer to the elbow or even all the way down into the fingertips. Now, the main nerves of that brachial plexus that we typically look for whenever you have what we determine to be nerve pain, the first three we look at are radial, median, and ulnar nerves. Those ones go down into the hand and fingertips. The musculocutaneous and the axillary nerves are other major ones of the brachial plexus, but those tend to stay up closer to the shoulder and upper arm area. They don't really cross the elbow at all. Next, another big piece of anatomy we have is the labrum. Labrum you can think of as kind of the socket to the ball and socket joint. It's made up of fibers, so it's like a fibrous tissue. And because of that, it actually has terrible blood supply. So when these get injured, typically it does hurt. However, it takes a long time to heal, and we'll typically immobilize things. So this is when you see people with a slap tear or Bankart, if those sound familiar. If not, it's just a tear in that labrum. And if we don't perform surgery on it, or even if we do, we tend to want to minimize movement fairly early on, just because with the bad blood flow, sometimes they can re-injure themselves very easily. So in the picture here, slap tear is a very common tear for the labrum. The circled part is the tear itself, and slap stands for superior labral tear with an anterior posterior direction. Long story short, the tendon that comes off to the left-hand side of that circle that's circled, that is your biceps tendon. So it attaches to the top part of that labrum, and it can pull on it. And you see how it kind of creates that kind of D shape in the tear. It's not like you typically think of tearing a piece of paper. Very common injury. Just as an example, it's not a fun when it hurts, of course, and then it just takes a long time to heal. Moving on to the next one, the joint capsule, another big piece of anatomy. So basically, a joint capsule surrounds almost every joint in the body, not 100%, but darn close to it. The joint capsule is a fibrous type. If you think of a deflated balloon that surrounds all of the joints, the point of that is to kind of hold in synovial fluid, keep things moving, add some stability, does a few things. But the biggest thing is the capsule itself can cause restriction. Because it is fibrous, it can start to form what we call as adhesions, or simply just getting tighter in other areas, kind of like that balance. And with the fibrous areas, because of it, if you get a restriction in one direction, it can kind of prevent motions in certain areas. For example, certain capsular issues can cause people to not be able to raise their arm up high enough. And a lot of times we lean straight towards muscles, but capsules can cause that restriction as well. Lastly, I believe for the anatomy section is we have a bursa. A bursa it's not like a capsule where every joint has them. However, we find them in a lot of joints, and basically similar to the capsule that it holds synovial fluid, the bursa holds its own kind of fluid as well. And excuse me, those are found in areas of high friction. So the picture of the shoulder is a good example. Those purple spots are bursas that we find in the shoulder. All of them are areas that as they move, they're more prone to higher friction. So you tend to find more of them around places like the shoulder or the elbow or the knee, as opposed to every single joint that maybe doesn't move as often. Tricky thing with a bursa is once it's angry, it likes to stay angry. Again, because it is typically in a high friction area. So they're areas we move a lot, and therefore they're just kind of tricky to rehab as well. We can do it, of course, it's just takes a lot of work. So moving on, anyone listening, if you have any questions, now is a great time to ask. Otherwise, if you're having shoulder pain, whether it's consistent or intermittent, kind of describe a little bit what kind of feelings you get with that pain. Is it a sharp pain? Is it grinding? Do you get noises? Does it burn? Is it achy? Feel free to ask any of those, of course.
I think that Cody says you guys went to high school together.
Oh, Cody, it sounds like we went to high school together. I don't get to see your last name, otherwise I would ask, but so moving on for the next part, pain generating structures. So we talked a little bit about different tissues can cause different kinds of pain. Now, this list is just an example. It's not all inclusive, and there are caveats to every one of them. When someone says it's a sharp stabbing pain, sometimes we think bones. Like if you have a broken bone, it tends to be really sharp, like someone's digging a knife in there. You can still feel a sharp pain with muscle pains, especially like if you've ever had a trigger point in your shoulder or your back, things like that, and someone digs a thumb into it, it can be a sharp pain. Again, not a perfect list, but just as idea. Muscles, we tend to think of as an achy or dull pain. I have burn there because there's different kinds of burns. So some people that exercise a lot can say things like, oh yeah, I'm feeling the burn. That would be a different type of burn compared to the next example, like your nerves. You can get burning there as well. And it sounds weird if you don't experience it to say there's different feelings of burn, but if you ever have them, you'll know what I mean. And it's kind of one of those things you can't describe, but you have to feel for yourself. Long story short, when we listen to your subjective portion, when we're asking you the questions, when you first come in and we're evaluating everything, those are keywords that we can ask about. What does it feel like? Again, not a perfect list, just a good idea. Next, why does it hurt? So there's different types of pain because we tend to experience different things. So for instance, the first example, tear or a break, we could be talking about a muscle tear. That would be a sharp pain typically. Or of course, broken bones. Other reasons it can hurt, impingement. So basically impingement means that somewhere along the line, whatever tissue is getting irritated is getting pinched or pushed upon, or basically running out of space. So it's hard to think about, but literally every portion of your body is taken up by something, whether it's a fluid, a tissue. Um, of course, your stomach and things are not great examples of that, but very little things in the body have space to just exist. They're all very well confined, and they run very close to other tissues. So when something gets pinched because it's run out of space, that's why it's starting to hurt. And that leads into the next one, irritation. Either it's rubbing on something it shouldn't, or maybe you put too much demand on it during an activity, whether it's lifting or tennis or something that caused it. So basically it's too much of stimulation, we'll call it. And then lastly, entrapment. Entrapment can be similar to impingement, where things are getting stuck or trapped. Nerves are a good way to think of this. If anyone's ever had sciatic pain, sometimes that sciatic nerve can get pinched either around a muscle or through a muscle. For some people, the sciatic nerve actually runs straight through a muscle known as your piriformis and your glutes. Just an example. So those are some reasons why things might hurt. Next, the differential diagnosis. This is where we put all of our years of schooling together. We have to first take a subjective history. That's where we ask you what happened. Of course, like every medical office, we have a stack of papers that we ask you to fill out. Part of that is telling us what happened. Did you fall? Did you trip? Did you wake up one morning and it just hurt? We kind of ask your opinion, because you'd be surprised at how often your opinion points us in the right direction. Next, we look at pain in specific motions or positions. So typically, we don't have to necessarily ask this question because you give it to us without realizing it. Good example of this, I go back to the sciatic nerve again because it's very easy to think about. Sciatic nerve runs down the back of your leg and it can go all the way into your toes. So one test that we do is called the slump test, and that's where we stretch that nerve as far as we can comfortably. Most people can go through 90 to 100% of the range of motion without having any issues, maybe a little pulling, no problems. Somebody that's injured or entrapped or whatever to their sciatic nerve, they might say something like, oh, it hurts when I get into the car. Now, the position we put you in for the slump test is almost a perfect mirror of somebody getting into a lower car. So we ask, hey, does it hurt when you get into a car? And you say, yeah, that flares it up like crazy. Well, you basically told us an answer to one of our tests that we'll probably do later just to make sure. But little things like that, we ask you tons of questions to try and figure out what is it that's causing the pain, and it's kind of clues. And we just refer to that as differential diagnosis. So here's where we kind of get into the nitty gritty part. What went wrong? Why does my shoulder hurt? So these are just some examples. First part is it could be that you're lifting with improper form or technique. And that sounds kind of rudimentary, but it's very true. Everyone from Arnold Schwarzenegger to this lady, I forgot her name and I memorized it before this, of course. She is actually silver medalist for the Olympic lifting team for America. She did awesome this year. But everybody like that, all our high-end athletes were taught at some point how to do the lift. And if you're new to the gym, or if you've never officially been taught, you just watched tons of people do it and think you can figure it out, maybe you did something really small, different, or wrong, so to speak. Another thing can be joint stability. A lot of people have injured shoulders in sports when they were younger, or maybe they were in a car accident and the seatbelt yanked on it and caused some, not necessarily permanent damage, but some long-standing damage to that joint that made it a little unstable. So now when they try to lift something heavy overhead, whether it be a snatch like this picture, excuse me, or simply any other lift, you can do a bicep curl even. If that joint isn't nice and stable in all directions and you put a very heavy load on it, it can cause some instability type pains that can start to wear on things like the labrum or the joint capsule that help hold that stability. Next thing, it could be some accessory muscle weakness or compensation. A lot of people think that when we lift weights, we are isolating muscles. So for example, you might think that doing a lateral raise is isolating your lateral deltoid. Realistically, it's almost impossible to truly isolate one muscle at a time. I would venture to say close to 99% of our movements are done by multiple muscles. We may have a muscle that focuses on that movement or is the primary mover, but there's always going to be something around that same area that helps either stabilize the joint or helps perform the lift, whatever it be. So sometimes if those accessory muscles are weak to the point they can't help enough, the main muscle you're focusing on could cause an issue. Maybe you rupture a muscle, or you pull too much and that pulls on the labrum, and that's kind of the weak link. Another thing can be inadequate range of motion. So this picture again of this young lady, those shoulders are very mobile. She's got great form in here. Obviously, she's an Olympic athlete. She better have great form. But the amount of weight she's holding over her head, if she had a joint capsule that was too tight, or let's say she didn't stretch appropriately and her lats are tight and she can't truly get that overhead reach with those posterior rolls, she might hurt something. So you have to make sure you have good range of motion to finish what you want. Lastly, I think this one's big for everybody. Are we simply lifting too heavy? Are we going too fast, too quickly, or lifting with an ego? Something I like to tell people is that when you're lifting weights, remember you're lifting for yourself. Even if it's, so to speak, we'll say looking good in a swimsuit or something, technically that's for yourself. And at that moment, you can either choose to look good for what I say the 1 hour in the gym, potentially hurt yourself, or lift appropriately for 1 hour and look good for the 23 hours you're spending out of the gym. So just make sure we don't lift too heavy before we're ready for it. Before we move into this next part, does anyone have any questions on anything? Not yet. So we will go into technique. It's all about technique, especially lifting weights, because if you're trying to isolate a muscle, either you may fail to isolate that muscle or you can cause some injuries. So these are just two random Google pictures, things to look for. Picture on the left, when performing a lat pull down, there's certain pieces you want to do. And the biggest thing is, it's not a video, so you can't see it, but the red side, the X mark, where you don't want to do this, a lot of people think they need to pull it down towards the ground. Makes sense. I can see why people think that, but that's not the goal. Your goal is to pull it towards you. So with a lat pull, the rule is you want to lean back just a little bit, not a huge lean. Some people go a little excessive with it, but a few degrees, 20, 30 or so, nothing crazy. Picture the green side of the left picture. It's a good example. And then with that same picture, as you're pulling, you're not pulling the weight towards the ground, you're pulling it towards you. So you're pulling those elbows down and back. That's the big part. You don't want to think about bringing your chest up to the bar. You simply want to hold that position and bring the bar to your chest. One piece of advice I like to give people is, once you hit that last piece where the bar is down close to your chest, under your chin-ish, doesn't actually have to go under the chin, a good way to truly engage the lats is to think about bending that bar. So think about bending it even further than that little kind of U shape that it's in. That'll truly help kind of engage the lats. Other example, picture on the right. Gentleman is performing a seated row. Technically, it is a good form, looks fine. I was using this picture more as an example of that isolation. We were talking about what is the goal that he's lifting. So with a row, the goal can be multiple things. If you are trying to hit your traps or trapezius, then if you notice in the picture, he does a little bit of a backwards lean, and then he returns to that upright position each piece. If you are only trying to hit traps, that extra row is just kind of wasted motion, and you potentially can injure yourself if you're not prepared for it. Now, if you were trying to just simply do an entire back exercise, that little bit of a lean back with every row is fantastic because you're prepared for it. You've got your core engaged, you know what you're doing. It's not a compensation, you're trying to do it. The picture itself, like I said, is a great example of good form, as long as that's what your goal is. Next, joint stability. So we have different forms of joint stability. We have active and passive stabilizers. Active stabilizers are ones that you and I can control. They're muscles. When a muscle is nice and strong, it can hold things together. You can put more load on it. These are examples of muscles that can make the what we call glenohumeral joint, basically the ball and socket, the main shoulder joint itself. Those are the active muscles that hold it in. Rotator cuff muscles are not fantastically strong. They're just not built to be. So muscles like the deltoid, the teres major, they're a little bit bigger, they're bulkier, they can hold more weight and more load. And so those are able to help hold everything nice and tight as you're doing an exercise. Next one, passive stabilizers. These are ones that you and I can't control. They tend to be a little bit harder to heal if they get injured because there's nothing we can do for these specifically, other than work the muscles around them or the joint itself to try to get those muscles or those tissues to move and kind of heal themselves. Examples of passive stability in the shoulder are your labrum. We talked about that earlier. Ligaments, those are a couple of ligaments that you actually have outside of the labrum that help hold the shoulder together. And then the joint capsule itself, again, that big fibrous tissue that holds the synovial fluid in. Next, the muscle accessory weakness. I love this picture because he's doing a deadlift. And with that, a lot of people that have done deadlifts understand that every muscle is involved. So ironically enough, why are the triceps involved in a lift like this? Because they're a stability, they're an accessory muscle. They may not help you lift that off the ground. And your goal isn't necessarily to keep a straight elbow because gravity alone is going to help that. However, this guy's triceps are activated because they're helping stabilize that elbow joint and part of the shoulder. So another good example, those anterior deltoids, his are activated again. He's not trying to raise that bar out in front of him, but those are helping to hold the shoulder joint together so his arms literally don't get ripped off of his body because that looks like a fairly heavy weight. So the accessory muscle weakness is a big one because it's kind of like the weak link in the chain. If he has an anterior shoulder issue, that front aspect of that shoulder, and let's say he injured it earlier playing Frisbee with his dog, this is potential risk to hurt his shoulder. Maybe it doesn't hurt the deltoid itself, but he could injure his labrum because maybe that's now the weakest link. Clearly, anterior deltoid is probably a little bit stronger than a labrum. So basically, you're looking for where does it break down? It can break down in technique or simply making sure you're not lifting with an ego and that everything involved is ready to put on the demand. So next, we have range of motion. These two pictures are great. Some people may argue picture on the left isn't great form because her chest is more upright and she's standing right with it. However, other people would say that it's fine. It's not a bad thing by any means. That's a big thing with weightlifting is there are some people that live on one side of the road and others that live on the left side where maybe they are absolutely gung-ho about how their form needs to be this way versus that way. Science is constantly changing. A big thing to look at, these pictures are not great for this, but their knees. A lot of people are grown up and taught that when you squat, your knees do not go over your toes. For some people, that is absolutely correct, depending on the issue, depending on the strength of the knee joint, all sorts of things. These two folks who are clearly good at what they do, they're competing in some sort of event, their knees are way over their toes. So an example of there's different trains of thought for certain pieces to it. Now, these pictures I chose for range of motion because the person on the left, clearly they have some pretty good hip mobility, person on the right as well, but something about them is pushing the gentleman on the right to lean forward just a little bit. And you can see his neck is kind of protracted out in front too. Whereas the other person, their shoulders are more stacked over their spine. Gentleman on the right has to have more extension to stack those because his chest is leaned a little bit forward. Is it a compensation thing here, or is it more technique? Did they simply learn and practice it a certain way? So we're getting into the part of our example lifts and everything. Before we go here, does anyone have any questions or maybe types of pain that you guys have experienced in the weight room or anything like that?
Sounds like he's a personal trainer. So.
Nice. Okay. So Cody's sounds like a personal trainer. So I'm sure you've got examples of these things. Good example as well is the fact that as I go through these example lifts and samples, maybe you learn different ways to do them. I'm not saying that my way is the absolute perfect way. I haven't done research with electrodes and everything to guarantee I've got maximum muscle activation. However, people have typically done them these ways and they've avoided injury. And so there's more than one way to crack an egg. I will kind of go over the basic portions of it. I won't hit every piece to a T. It's just an example, but also if you learned a different way, then I'm not saying my way is correct or your way is wrong, just one more way to do it. So example first is a snatch. Probably one of the hardest lifts to do because it is volatile, it's quick, it's fast, and you are throwing a lot of weight from the ground straight up overhead. With this lift, it's definitely a very tough lift, but if you can do it, it's a fantastic full body workout. Very similar to a deadlift, but deadlift tends to focus on full body simply because of the weight you're trying to get off the ground. Snatch is very technical. It's very much something to practice with lightweight and slowly work your way up. So big pieces to this with a snatch, kind of broke it up into a few steps. So the first step always is get set. You got to have your foundation. You got to get everything set up before you even think to lift. Good base of support. You want feet fairly wide. You don't want them super narrow. And your hands are typically out wider than your feet, out wider than your knees. If you've never done a snatch before, or if you're fairly new to them, a good way to figure out where to put your hands exactly is if you were to stand up with the bar should hit right around the hips. You don't want it too low into the groin or up into your stomach. So if your hands are too wide, it'll hit up closer to your belly button. If they're way too narrow, it'll hit closer to your thighs and your groin area. You want them wide enough that as you stand up, it's going to hit right on the hips. So get a good grip. Some people talk about a hook grip where the thumb is back and you grab a bar kind of like a monkey grip-ish. I personally cannot stand that grip because especially something like this where you're throwing with that overhand grip, you can drop the bar. And it's not so much you're going to drop it on the ground. These things typically have rubber weights and they can bounce. It's more you might drop it on a knee or a leg or heaven forbid your head or your neck. So always have a true like grip on the bar. Moving into the next part, the stand. So think of this similar motion as a deadlift. It's typically not the fastest portion. This one is very controlled. You want to make sure that it's not too much. And this is kind of the first guess as far as your body will figure out, am I able to lift this or am I putting too much demand on it? One thing to think about is it's all hips. So the picture on the left, the kind of silhouette there, you can see the gentleman's hips are back, his chest is fairly up, but he's not standing up yet. So the first part, the stand, it's just your hips, just like a deadlift. You're not trying to pull your chest up just yet. The first part is just that first pull. Step 3, call it triple extension. Some people call it the second pull, thinking the first pull is when you're pulling the weight off the ground. Triple extension refers to hips, knees, and ankles. So hips extend, your knees extend, and your ankles. You are finishing on your tiptoes because this is your power generating piece. This part is very fast and it needs to be really controlled. The silhouette in the middle is really nice because you can see that bar looks like it's hitting him right about in the hips. The bar itself should go straight up and down through the entire lift. There's no kind of arching out to try to get the bar out in front of you. It's a great example. His chest is up, his hips are extended, and his arms are still straight, and he's not trying to hold that weight out in front. So step number 4, excuse me. You can call it the third pull or turning the bar. Basically, they call it a third pull because when you're at this point and the bar is continuing to travel up past your chest, you think about pulling yourself underneath the bar. So that's why it's called the third pull or turning the bar. You're trying to turn that bar up overhead. However you want to think about it, if you've been taught different ways, the goal is either way the same thing. You're trying to get that bar as high as you can, and you are dropping underneath the bar, trying to get it below yourself or getting yourself below the bar. Step number 5 is the catch. This part is kind of mixed with the step number 4 because as you're pulling yourself down, one good thing to think about is stomping your feet. This point, when you catch, you want elbows locked out, shoulders in position already, because that's the weakest part of this is the upper extremities, the arms. Legs, stomping your feet, people say it helps them think about actually locking everything out and activating every muscle, because this is where all the weight hits you. Probably the most, I would say, dangerous part, because here, if you have range of motion issues in the shoulder or weakness in the arms, your upper back can't support the weight, anything like that, this is where people tend to drop it. Either drop it on their head, drop it on their neck, fail to drop it and have it bring their shoulders completely too far back, hurt their shoulders that way. This is basically the scary part. Catching the bar is the hardest part. If you can catch it, you can do the last part and stand up. Sounds easy enough, but trying to maintain that balance of the bar overhead and having good squat form at the same time, very difficult part. But it's the most straightforward part. You're just standing up. Does anyone have any questions on a snatch? Anyone perform them? Anyone new to them, never tried them, maybe intimidated by it?
Cody had mentioned that he was having some pain in his left shoulder when he externally rotates it.
Gotcha.
So when I retract my shoulder blades and try externally rotate it, pinch by the scapula. His chest too tight.
Okay,
Coming in from full range of motion.
it's possible. Cody's question was he gets some left shoulder pain when he essentially turns the bar or tries to externally rotate that shoulder itself. He gets a pinch in his kind of mid back area. It could be that the pecs are too tight. I would assume, without seeing it, of course, that if it was a pec issue, you would tend to get a little bit more anterior chest pain where that pec kind of connects to the front of the shoulder. Not always the case, but it could be. My first bet would be possibly rotator cuff muscles, because you are externally rotating that shoulder joint, or you have muscles like your rhomboids and your traps. People's lower traps and mid traps even tend to get really weak without focusing on them, just because as Americans, we walk around all stressed out with our shoulders shrugged up. So it could be one of those muscles, or you're just putting a large demand on it. And in a sense of power, this is a power lift because it happens one time very quickly. So if you think of a rubber band, or even like cheesy pizza or something like that, if you stretch something nice and slow, it can tolerate it. You can pull it back and forth, no issues. If you take that same rubber band and pull it extremely fast, it's more likely to snap. Now, I'm not saying the whole muscle is snapping, but maybe you have some fibers that are snapping and breaking because they just couldn't handle quite the load. And then, of course, once they're broken or pulled apart, you're then putting that same muscle under demand, maybe for your second rep or your third rep. If you're an avid gym goer, like most personal trainers are, it's also possible that maybe you aren't giving it enough time to heal enough to where that same piece constantly gets injured, starts to heal up, injured, starts to heal up over and over. Again, they're all ideas, they're possibilities without actually seeing them. So, and it is just a hard lift. It's a tough one to do, and it's very technical. So moving on, any other questions for the snatch?
Then snatch, but you're saying when he works on his shoulder mobility, it just pinches during the warm up, never during the lift.
Okay, so pinching during the warm up and not the lift. I would have to see, or at least ask you what most of the warm up looks like. Where exactly are you getting the pinch? It could just be part of the shoulder capsule as well, because capsules and those vascularized tissues don't have straight blood flow. They do take a little bit longer to warm up than a muscle would. My first thought is I would check joint mobility itself. And if the pinch is still coming from the back, the thing about the human body is there's tons of different pieces to it. One of my questions I get asked a lot is, oh, this pops every time. Is that a bad thing? And my response to it is, does it hurt? And if it doesn't hurt, typically I say it's not a bad thing, because bad things tend to hurt. And on top of that, if it doesn't hurt, it's really hard to pinpoint. Good example, myself, I get a trigger point, basically a tightened up piece of tissue that kind of sticks to itself, a knot, some people call it, on my shoulder, that when I move a certain way, after a long time, and thankfully after being a physical therapist and learning a bit about myself, it'll pop if I move it in a certain way. And for a long time, I was worried about a tear or a rupture of something. Sometimes it hurts, sometimes it doesn't, but I can get it to pop every time. And I realized what I was doing is taking my shoulder blade and pushing it up against my ribs by pulling it close. And then as I depress that shoulder blade, it's making that pop noise, which doesn't make sense for where the pop is. So my best guess, I don't have x-ray vision, but the best guess is that I have a knot in that muscle. That's the irritation part. It's the painful part. And by shoving it up against my ribs and then pulling it down, it's just bouncing over ribs. So there's tons of pieces that go into it. So your pinch that you're getting, it could be that maybe you have some sort of fascia or tissue that's not inherent to the joint itself, but maybe close to it, that is getting caught somewhere, getting pinched between bony prominence. Or as a personal trainer, I'm assuming muscles are fairly tight a lot, even though you do work on flexibility. Personal trainers, we lift a lot. You could have some hypertonicity in that muscle that's simply putting more pressure on something else and kind of pinching another tissue off. Could be many things. So it's one of those that we'd love to get you in and actually looked at, and we can pinpoint what's happening, even for just that little piece. So moving on from the snatch, next example, and again, just examples, lat pulls. We talked about this one a little bit earlier with that previous slide, but big thing with lat pulls, this picture is a good example. The shape of that bar, kind of like that D or C shape, the two bends in it. First part, again, decide your grip, get your foundation. So you want to make sure you have either a wide grip or narrow, whatever excuse me, whatever your goal is. We found that with a nice wide grip, you tend to get an easier time isolating the lats. I say the word isolate, can't truly isolate them, but you can focus on them. Whereas a narrow grip, maybe you're doing more of like a chin up type position. If you're in the military, that's your goal. You don't want to do it with a wide grip. So you tend to get more biceps, a little bit more of those accessory muscles as well. So whatever your goal is, you decide that from the very beginning. Next piece, a little bit of a lean back. Here, it's really important to keep your stomach engaged because you don't want a C shape as you're trying to lean. You want just a simple lean back. And that's basically, so this picture is really good to see that that bar is coming down at an angle. 3 pieces again, as you're pulling your elbows down and back. You're not trying to bring your chest up to the bar. You want to keep your shoulders down and pinched. Don't let them kind of shrug up. A lot of guys are doing this up in the gym. And then that last little bit, as you get the bar down to your chest, think about bending it. And that really helps kind of keep the lats engaged. But again, make sure you're not pulling your chest up to try to perform that. You're truly trying to just bend the bar. And then my personal tidbit is slowly lower the weight back down. A lot of weights are made out of lead or some form of lead coated type material or steel, whatever. They are strong, but they're not meant to be bashed around sometimes unless they are rubber coated. And I've been to many a gym where the weight stack has one broken plate. Not only can you no longer do your math, I'm terrible at math when it comes to stuff like that because you have a busted plate on top, or the gym will just simply take out and put an out of order sticker on the entire thing and you can't use it anymore. So resist it back down. Next example is the bench press, everyone's favorite, everyone's go-to, and one of their favorite pieces. So first step, again, same thing, decide on your grip. Do you want a wide or narrow? And this one, the jury's kind of out a little bit. If you tend to go wide, comfort thing, you might feel better in the shoulders. If you go narrow, you might have to bring elbows in, focusing a little bit more on triceps. Play with it. Everyone will eventually find their comfort spot, the thing they're trying to work on. Plant your feet on the ground. This kind of helps translate into a strong core. Might be a chest exercise or like a pushing exercise as people call it. Core is still engaged, or at least it should be. Next piece, control the descent. So once the bar's up, typically you want the elbows around 45 degrees. Some people will say, you can have them wider, you can have them narrower, depends on what you're working on, of course. One thing we do notice is people that tend to lift arms straight out at 90, they are a little bit more prone to anterior shoulder injury because just mechanics of that shoulder joint, and with typical American lack of range of motion, you tend to cause that shoulder bone itself to roll forward, and you can really put some pressure on those fairly thin tissues on the front. Again, up for debate, personal opinion, everyone has one. So whatever you feel, coming from me, I would advise people try to avoid straight 90 out, at least come down a little bit and give that shoulder a little break. Good idea is section B. It says put the bar in midline with your mid chest. Just good basic practice. Again, you can have small variations depending on what you're trying to isolate or focus on. So lastly, this little tidbit, pushing the bar back up. One cue that I tell myself that seems to help focus on the chest, and instead of avoiding things like arching my back funny or trying to compensate by twisting or pushing, is don't think about pushing the bar away from you. Think about pushing yourself away from the bar. So pretend the bar is like a wall that you can't push. So you're pushing yourself away, and you wouldn't do that all twisted and crazy like you would with the bar. So now in the big red question marks, some people that are more frequent to the gym talk about arch. Do you arch your back when you lift, or do you keep it flat? Traditionally, more classic thought process is you want your back flat on the bench, nice and stable, everything solid. Some science is coming out. We want to arch our back. It helps us pull our shoulders down and keep them away and prevent shoulder injury. Jury is out on this as well. I've looked into quite a bit of research. I've never done any of my own, but I've done some fairly diligent looking into it, and science can't prove one or the other. Some can show, instances towards left or right, but there's enough back and forth that we can't truly say which is which one's better. Personal opinion, what I teach people is a small arch, and that's not trying to find the happy middle ground, make everyone happy. The goal of the arch is to take your shoulder blade and pull it down and back. Now with that, we talked about compensation. Some people, they will pull that shoulder down and back by lifting their chest up, creating that arch. Ideally, you have a small arch simply based off the shape of the human body. What I don't like to see is I see people that are literally bent almost in half trying to bring their chest up. And they might say, oh, it's easier, or I can do more weight, or I feel more stable. If you break the lift down, think of the difficulty with an incline bench, a flat bench press, and a decline bench press. A lot of people find it's way harder to do an incline, a little bit smaller upper chest muscles, than it is to do flat, and even further, much easier to do a decline bench press where your feet are up high and your hands are down low. So if you break the human body into pieces when you're doing such a giant arch like that, we'll say this is somebody's feet, here's their head and shoulders where they're doing the bench press. Here is about their belly button or whatever it is they're folding themselves in half for. If you cut this piece out and ignore the whole front of this, their upper body is now doing a decline bench press, which makes sense why they feel like they're stronger or they can do more weight. If you were to simply straighten the legs out and do a decline, that's where you're at. Again, this is preference. This is just how I teach people. Some people might believe in doing the arch, the biggest arch, the better. Maybe they found some research that supports that. I haven't seen it myself. That's why I say a small arch, because anatomically, I feel like a small bend in the back, trying to make sure those shoulders are down and back, is better than staying flat and trying to round out and possibly causing a disc issue in the back or really causing that shoulder to roll forward, all sorts of different things. So question still remains, to arch or not to arch. And if you find some research leaning more towards one or the other, I'm always happy to hear it. I know that science is always changing for things. I mean, exercise, look back in the day, we'll call it, they had people on vibrating machines that put you on a weird leather belt and would just shake the snot out of you and think you'd lose weight. So who knows, maybe we find out in 30 years that lifting weights is a terrible waste of time and we can do this easier and more efficiently some other way. So things always change. Last piece to leave you with is don't lift with an ego. 9 times out of 10, that's where I hear the pain comes from, and that's where we get the injury. People are just lifting too heavy. I get people coming in, they say, oh, I was at whatever exercise I was doing and I was trying a 1 rep max, or I tried to get that last repetition in or something. And realistically, you should be able to hear your body tell you, that's enough, I'm tired. Now, we want to talk about progressive overload and all those theories about how you should push yourself. Absolutely. I'm not saying take it easy, because then you're never going to get the goals that you're trying to hit, but to an extent. If you're trying for a 1 rep max, make sure you've got a good warm up. Make sure it's a realistic 1 rep max. If you typically do, your sets and reps and stuff of like 200 pounds, and then you're going to say, well, I'm going to try to throw 3.5 plates on there and try to lift 360 pounds. Chances are you might hurt yourself. You haven't warmed up to it. You haven't gotten close to that to see if your body can handle it. And you'll find that weak link somewhere. Something will give, and that's where the pain comes from. So yeah, last piece is don't lift with an ego. Don't worry about looking good for the 1 hour you're in the gym. Worry about looking good for the 23 hours you're not in the gym. That being said, does anyone have any questions or statements? Any piece of advice that they've found that works for them? No comment yet? Okay, well, feel free to ever reach out. We will move on to the last little piece. And I believe Jenny's going to help me take back over with the tidbits and the details.
Okay. I guess I'll swing over. All right, so Cody, I was just going to answer you too on some of your stuff, but I guess I can do this offer first, and then it might make more sense anyways as to what we kind of probably need. But we want to say thanks for coming in, watching this webinar on your Thursday evening. Hopefully it was a little bit helpful. Hopefully you learned a few things, and past this point, we're always open for questions. So our emails are pretty easy. So it's usually just our first name at resolveptben.com. But every time we do one of these things, we like to give a special offer at the end. So for this one, we're going to give a good deal on a total shoulder diagnostic evaluation. So being a personal trainer for you, Cody, you probably know kind of what PT is about, but for a lot of you who don't know what PT actually is and what an evaluation is, we're going to kind of sit down and go over your current health and kind of go over previous injuries that you've had to your shoulder. So we'll talk about current problems you've had, past problems you've had. If it's all been on the same side, different side, if you had trauma or no trauma, those kinds of things. And then we'll check that shoulder mobility. And this is where, Cody, I would say maybe your issue could be with your shoulder pinching there. We'll check that stability that Casey talked about, all those important muscles that are there to stabilize that shoulder. We'll let you know if those are actually doing the job. And then if there's just a couple of particular lifts that are what's plaguing you with your shoulder pain, we'll review those right in here. And then we'll give you a summary of all of those findings. So you kind of know where your weak links are. You'll know if it's a posture thing. You'll know if it's a stability, mobility, those sort of things. And then we'll give you kind of an individualized home program to go with on there. So it's not sometimes that you have to be seen twice a week for the rest of your life to kind of figure this out. Usually we just have to see you once or twice, sometimes more, but to give you a few ideas of kind of what's going on. So that's kind of what an evaluation consists of. So we're going to give it away for $100 if you want to do a cash rate for coming tonight. So typically it's more around $165 when we do cash rates on this. We do take all major insurances as well. So including OHP or Medicaid, Medicare, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Pacific Source, all the major ones there. If you're not sure, if you want to go through insurance and you're not sure if it requires the doctor referral, just call us and we can tell you pretty quickly if one is needed or not. And kind of just first come, first serve. So how to schedule with us, you can call our office, phone number's right there. You can look it up on Google pretty quickly. If you're a busy kind of person, you can get on our website and just hit request appointment. And just when we call to schedule you, I just mentioned the shoulder webinar. You can always email just our generic email too, resolveptbend@gmail.com. And as I said in the beginning, we're over here on the west side, same building as Broken Top Bottle Shop. But sometimes, these evaluations can help us break down much better than kind of giving a general presentation as to what might work best for you. So Cody was mentioning some of the pinching in his shoulder blade, so if you can actually come in, sometimes we can tell you if a lot of guys, I'll speak from maybe female point of view, this is bad, but have really, don't have good mobility in their thoracic spine. So we would check that for you. Sometimes you just have too much lifting overuse going on. And so, we didn't even get into being able to talk about soft tissue, like a trigger point kind of thing very much. So it could even just be a trigger point sort of thing. And it could be a tendonitis. It could be a pinched nerve from your neck. And so we try to do our best on giving kind of generalized information, but definitely you can get a lot more specific information if we can actually get you in here and get our hands on you for sure. So anyway, thanks for coming. Cody, thanks for hanging out with us, hanging out to the very end. We appreciate it very much. And was there any further questions?
No,
Oh, maybe one popped up there.
Very minor issue for me, overall healthy shoulders. Thinking about coming in erector spine imbalance and ankle mobility.
Okay, well, we see it all, so I'd be happy to see you and still give you this cash value offer if that's what works for you, or let you know what insurance would cover and cost. So feel free to email us with any further questions, but otherwise we'll let everybody go home for the night. Thanks. Bye.